So I was looking at this data yesterday and I just graphed it. So we have German military spending and German GDP, which is from Macro Trends. It's the data, my data source. So I gathered this data, merged it together, and my question was, how can you? So NATO expects military every member state to spend at least 2% of their GDP on military spending. That is a well-known part of the treaty. And like anything, a percentage can go up or down for two reasons. Either your numerator changes or your denominator changes. And so when we see that European NATO member states are spending less than 2% of their GDP on military expenditure, this begs the question, are they spending less than 2% of their GDP on military because they've reduced military spending? Or is it because their GDP has grown faster than their military spending? So I gathered this data, Germany's GDP, and we find that, yes, back in the Cold War, Germany was consistently spending over 2%, as defined by the treaty, on their military expenditure. As soon as you had Wiedervereinigung, German military expenditure went below 2%, and it continued to decline as a percentage of GDP until basically the invasion of Georgia, and it's continued to be around 1% ever since. It's increased a little bit since 2020, but this is what we find in the data. So this brings us to the question. If we then look at military expenditure, we find that Germany has spent more actual money on their military expenditure according to macro trends in 2021, and probably more since 2022 when my data set ends, than at any other point in history. So we do find a positive correlation of Germany spending more on military now than ever before, despite the military expenditure as a percent of GDP has gone down to around 1%. So what's going on? Let me turn that off. If we put their GDP on, you're like, oh, well, the military expenditure has grown some. We find that their GDP has grown faster. Let's put our y variable as a log. And what we find, I just want GDP and military expenditure. What we find is that, yes, military expenditure has grown and GDP has grown, but their GDP has grown faster than their military expenditure. If we look at this, we find that, that's not going to work so well. For some reason, these colors are too close to each other. Oh well. So my point doesn't change. While German military expenditure has actually gone up, we have found that German GDP has grown faster, so your percentage spent on GDP has gone down. So it's not because Germany or the rest of Europe is skimping on their military. No. It's because their economy grew faster, especially before the austerity crisis, leading to their military expenditure. While they weren't skipping on military, they just didn't keep military expenditure up with GDP. That's why their percentage is down. It's Europe still. The other piece is that if you then do a summation of all of the GDP, all of the military expenditure of the European Union, as I do in this table, here, you find that the European Union spent $258 billion on military, which is significantly more than what China spent, significantly more than what Russia spent, slightly behind China. Of course, the United States has by far the largest budget in the world. So the question I then have is, hey, it looks to me, looking at this data, that Europe probably does spend about the right amount on military. I think the problem is that they've been following the United States lead on supporting Ukraine, And so while Europe has more than enough weapons to give Ukraine a complete victory in the war, if they don't send those weapons to Ukraine, what's the point? That's the issue. The US by ourselves, the EU by themselves, either one of us could unilaterally give Ukraine everything they need to become free. And the thing is, like with most EU countries, every EU country has a smaller budget, military budget than Russia because Russia's bigger than any European state in terms of both population and military expenditure right now. But they also spend a large percentage of GDP on military expenditure. But as a bloc, the EU by itself, this excludes NATO, which would put, NATO's by far the biggest military expenditure in the world. Like, it's not a question of how much we spend, is my point. The point is how we use it. Oh my God, it's not how big it is, it's how you use it. But that's absolutely true when it comes to military expenditure. If I go spend, $1 billion on clubs like what they used in ancient warfare, yeah, you spent $1 billion on the military, but it's not going to be very effective against guns. So it's, what are you spending the money on? Is it efficient spending? Are you getting the right deal on what you're spending? And then once you have modern military equipment, are you using it in an effective manner? This is what a lot of military observers I follow have said about Ukraine. Ukraine has a much smaller military than Russia. They have a much smaller arsenal. They have a much smaller GDP. But they've stalemated Russia through better tactics. This is what it comes down to. NATO has more than enough military expenditure by ourselves to completely obliterate any threat to global peace in the world today. We absolutely have the ability to do that. The problem is, are we willing to do it? And the Ukraine war is a major test. Will the United States defend Taiwan? If North Korea were to invade South Korea, will we defend South Korea? And it makes sense for Russia and North Korea and Iran and other countries to posture themselves as saying, oh, we have nuclear weapons. Because do we really know if that's true? Because it makes sense if we have now learned that all you have to do is say that you have the ability to use a nuclear weapon and we will hold back. You don't even have to necessarily put the money into nuclear war. You just have to make people believe that you have nuclear weapons, and then it doesn't matter how much money is spent on the military if you're unwilling to use it. So please follow people like Paul Warburg. Please follow Ukrainian Freedom Network. Please look around online. There are lots of Ukrainian people saying exactly the same thing that I am saying here. But I think what I can provide this hard data to prove that no, when Trump says Europe is not spending enough on military, I'm not convinced that's true. When the US says that, I think the real problem is, are we using the weapons that we've already spent money on, we being NATO, in a way which will be effective at deterring conflict? And if it doesn't matter, we could spend $2 quadrillion on our military collectively. It doesn't matter if China and particularly Russia doesn't believe we will use that $2 quadrillion of military equipment. It doesn't matter how much we spend. If we're spending that money on overpaying for contractors and paying too much for construction costs, then, but not getting our money's worth out of it, it then doesn't matter how much we spend. This is the problem. This is why the war is still ongoing. I believe right now Europe is basically on its own until Trump is out of office and until we get a Democratic president into the US. But my point here, if you look at the real life data, Europe spends, 2.25 over 8? That's 3 times the military budget of Russia collectively, not including the UK, not including Norway, not including Canada, not including the US. The European Union by itself has more than enough military expenditure to give Ukraine a complete and total victory. The EU by itself must have more than enough military equipment to give Ukraine a complete, unequivocal military victory, which I have proven in previous posts is the only realistic way. Well, let me just bring that up right. Is the only realistic way to, let me find my, I actually have a picture to show to finish this up. Ukraine game theory. Where's the SVG? There we go. And as I've demonstrated on my blog, I've used this game theory chart to explain why this is the only way forward. Ukraine and Russia at war, this is where we are now. We have three choices: increase aid, status quo, or reduce aid. This is the one on the far right is what happened in the 1920s. Russia wins the war, Ukraine's absorbed into Russia, as happened in 1921, which led to the Holodomor. Not an option. Status quo peace treaty, Russia accepts it, is what we had in 2014. We now know what happens as a result. Russia regroups and invades, return to top. We're finding that the Russia refuses return to top is happening over and over again right now with Trump's ridiculous work that he's doing, saying there's a peace treaty where Ukraine has pulled out of Kursk, but Russia continues to bomb Ukrainian hospitals and apartment buildings. We have to realize that neither Putin nor Trump are honest dealers. Neither one of them is telling the truth. So Europe needs to step up to the plate. I wish we had done more when Biden was president. That is a complete failure of my country, and for that, I am deeply, deeply sorry. But which leaves us only one path left. You can either reduce aid, you can do a status quo peace treaty like happened under Obama and Merkel, or you can increase aid, which is what I'm saying is the only real path. Ukraine can then win the war, and as I've demonstrated here, there's more than enough money from the European Union alone to completely end the conflict as long as they're willing to use it. Ukraine is then independent, and then the only real path to peace is Ukraine into NATO, because we've seen neutral Ukraine. We saw that in 1994 to 2014. Neutral Ukraine at peace leads to a Russian invasion. The only path to peace in Ukraine is for them to win the war by the European Union using the military expenditure they already have efficiently, sending those weapons to Ukraine, push Russia out of Ukraine, let Ukraine continue to destroy Russian oil depots. That is an effective strategy, and that's going to starve the Russian military of their ability to invade further, and then Ukraine wins, they regain all of their territory, Donbass, Luhansk, and Crimea, and then they join NATO, and then there will be peace. That is the only path to peace in Ukraine today. We have the money, we have the weapons, we have everything we need except the political will. Now that Biden is out of the way, and that Trump has clearly demonstrated that he is a nefarious actor, which surprises nobody who has actually studied his history, we are left with the only realistic conclusion of that Europe does spend enough on military. They do have the weapons that are needed. We just need to use them. This is how we can have peace now, and this needs to happen. Slava Ukraine.